on the impact of the hikes, we're joined now by Dmitry Grozoubinski. He's the author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade. He's also the director of the consulting firm Explain Trade. Thanks so much for joining us on the program today, Dmitry. We heard about some examples there in Germany and Mexico in terms of how these levies will affect those countries. What's your take on how this 50% increase on steel and aluminium will affect the industry overall as well as the global economy?
Well, I think the challenge is that it's just not clear what the goal here is and how this is supposed to achieve it. The president has said that his goals are to increase steel production in the US, but most US steel demand is met domestically. And it is very difficult to imagine anyone making the multi-billion-dollar investments required to replace some of that imported capacity, as those in your previous segments were saying, often highly specialized steel products on the basis of tariffs that may not be here 3 months from now. So I think it's going to have an upward effect on prices without necessarily spurring a huge wave of new investment or creating very many jobs, because steel manufacturing in 2025 is simply not a labor-intensive process, but a capital-intensive one.
And we know, of course, that steel and aluminium are used in washing machines, consumer electronics and cars. Much of the auto industry relies on a global supply chain. So how do these tariffs impact products being made with a mix of local and foreign parts?
So a lot depends on how the US will apply its rules of origin, so how it will look at cars coming into the United States to determine whether the amount of steel and aluminum that went into them, if it was foreign, will affect the tariff they pay. So the US has some ability to keep foreign steel that comes in as parts of things like washing machines and cars out of its market, and that could have a negative effect. But more broadly, it's going to drive up the costs of those materials, which drives up costs for producers and ultimately consumers.
So just simply, who is this tariff going to affect more? US consumers or the countries trying to export the materials?
I think the impacts will be acute on those trying to export. If you are a steel producer around the world, you're now facing much steeper costs trying to sell into the US market. And of course, that hits you quite acutely because that is what you do, that's your livelihood. For the US consumers, it will be a much more spread out impact, but much wider. Everything becomes a little bit more expensive, from building a house or a highway to buying a car. So it's diffuse versus targeted impacts, but it's fairly significant for both.
Right, so for the countries exporting, retaliations are inevitable, as we've already seen. What is the most effective form of retaliation, in terms of what countries in Latin America and European areas that we've just heard about can make with a superpower like the United States? I mean, we know that Beijing has previously responded by targeting shipments of rare earths, including pausing many of them, minerals that are critical to the US economy. Are these kinds of more targeted attacks likely to be the best way to go?
I think it depends a lot on, frankly, your weight class. If you are a Beijing or a Brussels, you have the economic mass to look at ways to potentially cause the US economy reciprocal pain, whether by pausing exports of something they need, like rare earths, or applying tariffs on finished products that are iconic or politically sensitive, like agriculture, Kentucky bourbon, Harley-Davidson, and thus you raise the cost for the US. If you are a smaller country standing alone, your ability to retaliate is significantly reduced, as is your vulnerability to US escalation. So countries in that pool may either look for allies or may take a more conciliatory or wait-and-see approach to the United States because they have less power and more to lose.
Just speaking more broadly, China and the US seem to have moved, though, from battling over tariffs to flexing their control over global supply chains. What do you make of this, and has it been a long time coming?
I think this has certainly been a long time coming. I think China has been very aware that the US sees it as a geostrategic rival and has known that the US may at some point leverage its economy to try to affect Chinese growth or Chinese policy decisions. So has been preparing for this for a while. I don't think you can separate supply chains and tariffs. At the end of the day, the tariffs are about reshaping global supply. So it's all part of the same conversation, but certainly it's been a long time coming.
If this system now rests on the idea that the United States should be the sole global power whose rules other countries need to abide by, what does that mean for the future of global free trade?
I think we should be cautious in framing it that way. What the US is trying to do is to determine what rules you should follow in order to sell into the United States. Now, United States is a major market and it is a lot of consumption, so it's a valuable market, but it is only about 13 or 14% of world trade. So some of the opinions we've heard about how the US is going to kill globalization or end intercontinental or regional supply chains overestimate US strength. But I think certainly what we can take away from what is happening is that countries can no longer rely on the treaties governments have signed as part of free trade agreements or the World Trade Organization as a guarantor of predictability. Countries like the US are willing to break the rules or to go back on their commitments in pursuit of other priorities. And that's going to make everyone think twice about their long-term decisions.
Just briefly, Dmitry, how will the global economy look in 6 months or a year's time if these tariffs are still in place?
If these tariffs, if the broad range of US tariffs are still in place, it will look weaker, but it will look especially weaker if the cycle of unpredictable tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs paused, tariffs restarted is ongoing, and there is no predictability for investors, supply chain managers, or consumers.
Dmitry Grozoubinski, really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.